Welcome to the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. I'm your host, Kate Powell. In a world where humans who feel vibrant, whole, and fully alive seem to be increasingly rare, where burnout and brokenness seem to be increasingly the norm, both in individuals and our larger ecosystems, it seems worth exploring how did we get here? And more importantly, what perspectives or what cultural practices or what spiritual, ancestral, or animist wisdom processes might help us stay true to the spark and rhythm of our aliveness on this wild, heartbreaking, but ultimately rare and precious life. Thank you for being here. May these conversations help us to stay human in the face of dehumanizing forces. May they nourish our wild, tender hearts, and may they plant seeds which flourish into a more regenerative and vibrant future. Welcome back to another episode of Wild Sacred Journey podcast. And I am Kate, your host and sort of fire tender of these conversations. And I don't have a candle with me today to light, so we'll just kind of take a moment to imagine the spark here between us for us all to gather around. And so wherever you are, as you're tuning in, just maybe take a couple breaths and just kind of let yourself land into the conversation and into some sort of presence. We can always hear better when we're present. And so I'm really excited today, to get into some conversations around culture and this idea of the Indigenous memory of Mother Europe and stories and things like that with Tad Hargrave, who's been on the podcast before, speaking more about marketing for hippies and culture, and then Kakisimow Iskwêw, who is, new to me, good friends with Tad, and is sort of doing a lot of culture reclamation work, both for her own First Nations background as well as then her European lineages. So I will read you their bios. Okay, Tad Hargrave is the founder of Marketing for Hippies with a mission to restore the beauty of the marketplace. He spent years learning his ancestral language of Scottish Gaelic at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia and Savile Ostag, right? Something like that. I'm pronouncing that probably more in the Irish Gaelic way than in the Scots Gaelic. On the Isle of Skye in Scotland. Do you want to share how it's pronounced, Tad?
Salmo Roslik.
There you go. And building strong relationships in the Gaelic communities in Scotland and Nova Scotia. He spent the last year studying ancient history, comparative mythology, and Indo-European folklore, as well as being a scholar in the Orphan Wisdom School with Stephen Jenkinson since 2014. His life is devoted to blowing his breath on the smored coals and feeding the still living but starved culture of our ancestors and trying to find ways for it to live again in this modern neon-lit strip mall existence we find ourselves in. Tad was born in Edmonton, Alberta, traditionally known in the local Indigenous language of the Cree as Amiskawasi.
Amiskwachi.
Amiskwachi, there we go. I'm learning lots of good words today. Beaver Hill, in parentheses. And later,
Amiskwachi Waskayagan.
There we go, Beaver Hill House. And his ancestors come primarily from Scotland, with some from the Ukraine as well. He now spends his time in Duncan, British Columbia. Coetsun?
Cowichan. Yeah, they're
Cowichan.
They're where the Cowichan sweaters come from, this area.
Oh, lovely. And so I'll have, and you can learn more about his work, and he has a Substack link, and I'll have that in the show notes. And so Natalie, or Kâkîsimow Iskwêw, is a Metis Cultural Educator who helps guide Indigenous people reclaiming their culture to connect with their living teachings around art, food, language, and connection to spirit. As an Indigenous woman, Natalie seeks to bring her traditions, stories, and culture to life. She lives in northern Alberta on an off-grid homestead where she offers traditional skills and Indigenous arts focused classes, sharing on topics such as brain tanning, moccasin making, beading, traditional Metis silk embroidery, and building relationships with the land. Natalie is a caretaker to a family of Indigenous horses who she shares the land with. Every year she offers culture camps and wasakam, Indigenous food, sovereignty camps, where she shares food sovereignty skills such as foraging, butchering, food preservation, and caring for the land. Natalie hopes to connect her community with the skills, arts, language, stories, and culture of her culture. Natalie graduated from Harvard University with an ALB degree. Before studying at Harvard, Natalie attended Lethbridge College, where she studied renewable resource management and explored her passion for the land, plants, and animals of her nation's homeland. Natalie supports her community to build relationships with our plant relatives through plant camps for Indigenous nations, universities, and community groups. And then she's at meetingmyancestors.com, so you can learn more about her work there. And again, I'll have that link in the show notes. So
Wonderful.
lovely. Amazing
Thank
to
you for
have you
having
both
us.
here. Yeah, thanks for being here. So how would you, that might serve as introduction enough, or would you like to kind of introduce yourself in any more sort of social fabric kind of way, or would you like listeners to know anything else about you? Kind of
For me,
sometimes,
I imagine stuff will come out as we talk, though.
yeah,
Yeah, same here. I think that's a beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. And conversations always bring out a little bit more.
they do. Yeah, lovely. Okay. Well, great. Well, let's dive right in to kind of the foundational stuff, which I think in this moment is what do we actually mean, at least within the context of this conversation, when we talk about Indigenous and culture and whiteness, because I'm sure those terms will come up and those can be quite loaded terms for a lot of people. There's a lot of, yeah, stuff that kind of comes dragging along behind those words. Yeah, so I'd love to just kind of, yeah, open it up with letting you guys speak to that.
Well, maybe before we do, it might be helpful for people listening to hear how it is that you decided that we were a good idea, or how it is that we came to be here, because I think that may set the stage for those particular
Sure.
questions.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. So, I mean, within my work, I definitely have kind of come to view my work as culture work. Although I have not been to Orphan Wisdom School, it's definitely through listening to some podcasts of Stephen Jenkinson and then traveling in some overlapping circles with Tad, that's definitely kind of what it's come to be. And for me, I started my journey doing sort of my healing or repair work, if we want to, I prefer that term to healing. I started that with yoga and meditation, and then it kind of transitioned into more of a shamanic and energetic healing practice. And I went through a 3-year training in that, sitting in council, um, and even then, my teachers, it was a much more animist and sort of quote unquote indigenous culturally training. And yet they weren't speaking to that explicitly. But as I kind of was graduating, the more I did the work with clients and with myself, the more it was like, wow, we can't repair some of this stuff because it's actually not any of ours individually. It's far more collective. And so I started to realize how much it was cultural. And then I started to realize, how much, as I was sitting in on conversations that were happening around cultural appropriation and particularly within these worlds of yoga, meditation, shamanic healing work, all of which have kind of exploded, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years, especially, although they've been, um, certainly heading that direction for longer than that. But as I was sitting in on conversations around cultural appropriation, I started noticing within myself that, yeah, there would be these little twinges of fear, entitlement, defensiveness, all of these kinds of things. And so as I would sit with those I was like, oh, I know what to do when these happen. And so I would just like kind of like go into them and I'd be like, okay, show me what you want to show me. Tell me what you want to tell me, where I'll follow you. Take me where we need to go to get to the root of this. And so as I was kind of sitting with that one day, I followed it all the way down to, and I saw this image of roots that had this like massive rupture in them. And I just felt this overwhelming, just immense wave of ancestral grief and loss. And it really clicked for me like, oh, wow, yeah, before my ancestors went out and colonized other people, they themselves were colonized and disconnected from their land and disconnected from their language and disconnected from their culture. And yeah, and so just sitting with that sort of opened up a whole deeper layer of understanding for me. And then I noticed that that started allowing me to kind of show up very differently in conversations around race, around culture, around entitlement and appropriation, around this kind of work, because I could lean into doing some of that healing within my own roots and sort of trying to find, yeah, what are the common threads and how can I take, or take is probably not the right word, but how can I honor what I've had access to that have not been from my lineage in and use what they've taught me to now go looking for these threads within my lineage. So that's kind of been my personal journey. And so then and so along the way, I kind of rediscovered a love for story and storytelling and, you know, kind of these deeper conversations. And so I know that Tad, and then, like I said, Kâkîsimow Iskwêw is newer to me. Natalie is newer to me. So I don't know her as well, but I'm excited about, you know, I know Tad. And so they're doing a conversation around Briar Rose and the story of Briar Rose. And so I'm sure that will come up more in our conversation and we'll kind of get to talk a little bit more about that program. But yeah, I'm just seeing some common threads in sort of what I feel kind of calling to me and exciting me about sort of the potential for this work. And, you know, and I have a lot of, I feel even though I haven't yet sat in one of your Briar Rose sessions yet, I feel the integrity and the compassion that you both are holding this work with. And so, you know, yeah, I'm personally really excited to just kind of keep these conversations going because I think these are really important for this time. And again, I'm sure we'll get into this, but, you know, Tad, even after our last conversation, there was someone, I don't know if you saw, who commented on the YouTube video. And, you know, she was really excited about this conversation around European culture and sort of European ancestry culture. And yet when I mentioned the term whiteness, she said, oh, no, I don't ever use that word. That's not a helpful word. And you know, and so I said, you know, I'm not here to tell you what's right or wrong, but here's my story with why I use that word, you know. For me personally, it feels like we have to acknowledge it because that is part of the ground we're standing on right now. So anyway, so I'm kind of sharing that to kind of bridge us in a little bit because I think, you know, we're standing at this threshold where people are hungry for something. And there's a lot more conversations around, for those of us of European descendancy, why we are not quote unquote, not allowed to be hungry for these other things, but we don't know where to look otherwise. And so we end up with these kind of, yeah, I think that's a really challenging place to be for people, to realize you're hungry and not know where to go from there. So that's why I'm excited to have these types of conversations. So it was kind of a long thing, but hopefully that actually laid some groundwork then for the listeners and maybe even for you both as well to kind of where we can, yeah, then start to go with kind of what you're bringing to the world and why you feel this is important. And yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was thinking as you were sharing, Kate, how common an experience, and by common, I don't mean, you know, we should dismiss it. It's just ho hum, but how much of a shared experience it really is, that searching and sometimes finding those seeds somewhere else and then realizing, oh, I have this also. And you know, as a Métis person, you know, growing up, I knew that I was Indigenous. My grandmother was very clear with us, you know, you're Métis. And, you know, what that meant slowly unfolded to me. But as a youth, I explored everything but my own culture first. And it all kept feeling fabulous and wonderful and not right for me. And it wasn't until I turned my direction back home and realized, oh, there is something deep and beautiful in this culture that I come from. And I work a lot with Métis. So Métis as a background, we have a lot of First Nations relatives, ancestors, and a lot of European ancestors. And they actually combined hundreds of years ago into their own nation and their own traditions and their own culture. But we have threads of both. And even as I was beginning to connect with that culture that is of my own nation, there was always a part of it that felt careful where you poke. And it was this unwritten experience that if you dig into the European side, you need to tread carefully, as there's these landmines sometimes in our experience of exploring ancestry. And I feel for me, the reason this work and working with Tad, looking at these indigenous memories of story from Europe, is so important, as it helps us unpack the landmines, first of all, that are preventing us from poking the sore spots of connecting with culture. And for me, on that side of my ancestry, but that there's so much richness once we do begin to unpack that and get past the grief, like you shared. And I not even get past it, but acknowledge it, hold space for it. There's so much more there sitting with it. So thank you for sharing your experience and how it relates to this. I appreciate that so much. And I think it's something likely that your listeners resonate with, but that a whole bunch of Métis people really resonate with too. There's a lot of grief when we begin to unpack it, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that holding that statement, hurt people, that's really like where it kind of started clicking in deeper for me, is like, in order to dehumanize other humans to the extent that many of our ancestors did, or that even if, for example, somebody on North American soil, even if, or so-called North American soil, even if, their ancestors arrived maybe post the initial wave of colonization, the initial wave of genocide, the initial wave of the violence, it doesn't mean that there isn't a benefit that the fact that they could arrive, So I want to name that, because I think that's another thing people often come up wasn't a part of it. My ancestors weren't a part of it. They came later, and just to kind of name that grief is, I think, still there. It's maybe matters of degrees or matter of, different shades. But yeah, in order to dehumanize others, I mean, we have to be hurting so deeply, and we are hurt so deeply by the dehumanizing. And yeah, I think you're right. We just have to, the other phrase that I think helps me a lot with this is like, also that, it's not just about, I remember one of my teachers said one time in my training, he said, sometimes your clients are going to come to you and the session is going to be a celebration. And he said, and that's actually just as important a session as the sessions where you're like going in and quote unquote trying to find what's wrong, right? Because if they come to you and they're like, oh my gosh, look how far I've come. You're like, great, what else is wrong? At a certain point, that's actually harmful. And so I hold that too, in the sense of like, we have to be building something. We have to hold the grief, and we have to be kind of tracking for something that is nourishing. Otherwise, you just get lost in the grief. I'm curious, does that kind of like land for either of you with your experience, or what's kind of been your experience around that?
There's a couple stories that come to mind. One is when I was in Scotland, where you are now, but at the storytelling festival, which I think you were just at, I met a fellow, Robert Seven Crows Burdant, and I don't know if he was there the year you were there, but he was a Indigenous storyteller from Quebec, and he does work in prisons with men there who've done caused harm. And I asked him, I said, how do you deal with the shame they must feel? And he paused and he said, you don't start with that.
Mm.
So you have to start with helping them remember who they are. And I said, you mean at a cultural level? And he said, yeah, because there's so many Indigenous men, and helping them reconnect with that is a precursor to being able to look at the shame.
Mm-hmm.
And that just focusing on the trauma will turn you into ashes. Just focusing on the ugliness in the world, and there's plenty of it, um, does a number on us. There was a quote, Alberto Vildodo, I don't think I'm pronouncing his name right, but his teacher chastised him one day. He said, accused him of being a gardener. He said, you're so good at weeding, but you don't know how to make things burst into flower. And they're different skills, but they're both needed. And perhaps this is one of the challenges with what's become of certain branches of activism is the immense self-hatred. There's a kind of weeding. I'm just going to try to remove every bad thing, but there's not an equal proportionate focus on creating beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And this to me is so much of the heart of it. Because the world doesn't need more ugliness. The world's got plenty of that. The world does need beauty. To create the beauty, we often have to come face to face with the ugliness that would stop us from making beauty in the first place. If you try to make beauty from a place where you're so hurt, you're likely to repeat that. If you're dealing with and carrying cultural poverties, the cultural poverties are likely to run the show when you're trying to make the beauty. And what you were saying too about the dehumanizing to me is so important because most traditional peoples I've heard, their names for themselves, one, are not the names they're given by the colonizing state, that comes in and picks a name for them, which is often derogatory in some way. The name usually translates as the people, something like this. And in Ireland, there's the Tuatha De Danann, and but it just means the people of the goddess of Dana, or the various understandings. But this understanding of we understand ourselves as the people, we understand ourselves as human first and fundamentally. And in an age of self-hatred where number one, being human is bad because look at what we've done to the planet. Maybe the world would be better off without humans. That's a bummer to walk around with all day. And then number two, my God, you're white. You're a white human. How can you even stand yourself to be walking around as a white North American or British or from any of these colonizing countries? And so to be operating from that place of self-hatred and having that be the orientation, it's like driving a car by staring at everything you don't want to hit, or driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror and only focusing on every mistake you've ever made. It's not a good way to operate.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And if you imagine operating with or being asked to live in that for too long, we need something. It's too easy to give up when you don't have something more meaningful to connect to. And you were mentioning appropriation before, and this is the heart of it for me, is if you ask somebody to hate who they are, how can you then ask them not to be something different? You're essentially saying you have to keep hating yourself then. And that's not fair. We see that when I have 5 children, and when they get in trouble, when you tell them you've done something wrong and you have to stop doing that, you then need to turn it around and tell them, but I love you, and I love when you do this, and I love when you treat me this way, and I love it when you say it like this. That you can't just leave them with what they did wrong. You have to direct them again to here's something beautiful that you are. And I think right now what we're largely and perhaps subconsciously doing in some of these discussions around reconciliation is saying what you did was wrong. No, not you literally. What this group of people did is wrong. It's bad. You need to be held accountable for what happened. Here's all the damage. Can you please look at what you did to us? And then wanting people to stay there, and that's not going to help anybody. Building shame. Shame is a tool, but only, as Tad was alluding to, only if you already know who you are and you have something to fall back on, then it's powerful. But if shame is all you're asked to hold and carry, it will eat you alive. And so we need people not to fold under the pressure of shame. We need to have a background for everybody who's exploring this collective dumpster fire that we have sometimes found ourselves in, and say, you have something to fall back on, though. There is something deeply beautiful in these people that you come from also. Circumstance brought us to some real ugliness. As Tad mentioned, the world is full of that ugliness, but that there are beautiful underpinnings that can teach us not just what we did wrong, but how to behave now. That there's this beautiful tradition rooted in something so deeply meaningful and bigger than ourselves. Drawing that out is better at changing our future circumstances together than, beating the dead horse and saying, keep looking at that. Don't you close your eyes. Keep staring. Keep feeling the shame. Look at all the horrible things. And, that has a place. We need to acknowledge those things. But turning and saying, here's the beauty that you could create in your own roots also. That's so powerful.
It brought up just a few things too, is that if people are confronted with punishment for what they've done, or shaming, this kind of chastising, it takes a lot to respond to that in a way that doesn't just fall into one of two things. Either you submit and you're right, I'm a bad person, and I got the memo, and I'll be a good boy, I'll be a good girl from now on, or rebel, and you can go to hell. And we see this in this conversation around whiteness. On one side, of course, the extremes, because most people don't even think about this at all. But on the extremes, you've got this profound self-hatred. I submit. My only identity is as an ally. That's it. There's nothing good I come from. All the goodness is with you. And so I'll just do whatever you say, which can be a real mixed bag depending who you're dealing with. But on the other side, you've got this rebellion. And so you got the white nationalists, like, we're not going to be ashamed of being white anymore. There's nothing wrong with being white, without any conversation about what do we mean by white. And that, as Kakisimow Iskwêw is saying, shame can be a powerful tool if it's used in restoration. That shame is, usually not the first resort. It's not the first port of call. I remember talking with a mutual friend, Kakisimow Iskwêw, and I have Lewis Cardinal. And I said, what happened if a man behaved badly in your community? He said, well, first, maybe an older man come talk to them and just say, hey, maybe you just don't do that. If that didn't work, there might be an older woman who would come. If that didn't work, a lot of women will come, and you didn't want it to get to that place, So the shaming was not the first. Actually, and even before the conversation, I remember talking with George McPherson, the storyteller on the Isle of Skye, who's in the hospital now, and he said if there was something that happened, low level trouble, but needed to be dealt with, probably that night around the fire or the next night, the Shanachie, the storyteller, might tell a story that would be aimed at that person, but they wouldn't even look at that person. And 2 weeks later, that person might come and say, that story, I just realized that I did this thing. Oh, really? Oh, wow, that's interesting. But there'd often be a first move of not to shame. But if shame is used here's a chance as a last resort to reaffirm your citizenship among us. Like, we want you here desperately. And so we're using this to bring that about, to give you a chance to say yes to being one of us again. That's great. But what if you don't have a community to affirm your citizenship in? And now there's shame. There's nowhere else to go. And which brings us to that reconciliation, that word, Stephen Jenkinson made an interesting point. He said, the reconciliation. In some cases, there was no conciliation. There's no to happen, but there was conciliation in some places. And the thing that I think we've forgotten largely as white people, particularly white people who are trying to do something about the troubles in the world, is it's not just the indigenous people living here that we need to reconcile with. It's our own ancestry. Yes, there's a bridge between ourselves and the people and the places we live who are from those places. But there's also this bridge to back home, which, as Kakisimow Iskwêw was saying, we fled often under very desperate circumstances to come here, and that bridge got burned. A lot of the elders did not make it on the journey. I mean, they didn't survive, or they stayed home. They weren't, well enough. So you had a lot of young people coming, and there was a real, we're here now, we're not there, we're burning the bridge. We are now North American or over a few generations. Maybe the people who came, I'm Irish and proud of it. The kids, yeah, we're Irish. But by the time you get to the grandkids or the kids, it's Ireland is a rumor. It's something you heard about, but it's not you. No, I'm American, and so that bridge gets burned. But there were needed cultural, spiritual supplies and sustenance that were coming over that bridge, and when it's gone, now we're hungry. Now we're starving, and that's no good.
And all you've got is whiteness, then, you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't imagine back then, in those first generations of people coming, that when you introduced yourself, that they would be saying, oh yes, I'm so and so and I'm white. That wouldn't have been in their minds, that wouldn't have factored into their identity at all. And yet it's so deeply entrenched in identity too. Oh, what are you? Oh, I'm Heinz 57, I'm just white. And it's such a forgetting. It's a cultural forgetting that happens. Tad was mentioning that burning of the bridge. That's the forgetting. And how beautiful and important that storyteller around the fire to bring somebody back to who they are without confronting them. When my elders, they say there's two ways of teaching. You can teach with a story and be gentle, or you can go the kaya way, which is the stop it and, really call them out. And that the kaya elders, the ones who call you out and are really harsh about it, that you don't always want to be known as that person, because the storytelling, that it creates such deep change in people. And imagine that around that community, when somebody had done something wrong, that there was no story left to tell, or there was no one who knew the story to call them back and to give them the opportunity to be healed, to be called home by the story that was held in that culture. And for Indigenous people here, but also Indigenous people around the world, that's a reality that we've been facing, is that who holds the stories anymore? Who's still telling the stories? Who even knows what they mean to know that that's the story to use in this circumstance? This is the one that needs to be told. Because once you burn the bridge of cultural forgetting, there's so much effort to dig it up. When you need to go and dig up those roots again, you don't know where they are. And so you're just digging everywhere. And I mean, this is that cultural orphanhood, is we're just going around digging holes all over the place, hoping to find something. Oh, there's a pretty flower there. That's where my culture is, maybe. And so I dig there and I'm looking for the roots. But then I get there, I'm like, oh, this wasn't it. This isn't right. It doesn't fit. And so, those stories, they're that flower that still exists, that's pointing to where the roots are, that we can dig for, and we can connect with those roots once again. And what I love about both of you having experienced these storytelling festivals, and for me sitting with my elders hearing our traditional stories, is that the stories are one of the most powerful ways to find those roots again, to connect with them, and to begin to learn what is there, what was perhaps a part of these ancient, beautiful cultures that was a part of that forgetting of burning the bridge when people came here.
The way do you feel like Because obviously, there's a lot of there's story, there's song, there's food, there's a lot of ways that I think culture gets kind of continued, a lot of different layers to that. Why do you feel like stories seems to be such a potent one? Like, what is it specifically about stories that seems to hold so much of that memory? It's kind of a big question, but
Huge-
yeah.
It's a huge question and a fabulous question. Oh, that was good. All right. So, one of the things that Tad and I have encountered as we're working right now, we're working with the story of Briar Rose, which um, it's deep. There is so much there. And the thing is that when we hear that story, when we watch the Disney version of Sleeping Beauty, we are witnessing it at a level. And we don't know necessarily that there are deeper levels to experience of this story. And a story can hold all of those levels all at once. And you can hear the story in 5 minutes and you heard the entire culture in 5 minutes because stories, they elicit imagery and they elicit, you can sometimes smell what they're talking about in the descriptions. There's relationships that are being expressed in the story. You have connections to the land. They're talking about a certain tree, not any tree. They're talking about a specific tree. And if you dig into why that tree, there is a wealth to explore in that. So why does story share so much with culture? And you also mentioned, there's food. I would say there's arts, there's language, there's ceremony, there's that spirituality. There's so much to culture. All of these combined are culture. And why does story matter so much? Because it has capacity to hold the entire culture all at the same time. Food holds culture in a way, and songs hold culture, and ceremony holds culture. Stories have this capacity to hold it in what I feel is one of the most full versions of it, because we have the smells, the sights, those connections to land, the relationships, they're all there in the story. So for me, that's why, and that's my experience with my culture. As I begin to unpack, it's not just the most recent rendition of culture that I get to experience with story. I get to experience something from thousands, tens of thousands, and longer ago, because these stories have been around a lot longer than we could possibly imagine. And sometimes, especially as we dig into Briar Rose, we're experiencing the versions of the story that traveled from place to place, but also through time, and that the story is a living thing. It's not this pinpoint in history, and it wasn't alive then, and it is no longer now. It is still a live thing, and it had to adapt, just like many of our ancestors, through time, through shifts in place, through shifts in governments, regimes, changes in what was acceptable, taboos have changed, and so the story shifted and changed too. And so we can see this cultural progression of, if I follow this story back, I see these different times along my culture's experience. And there's something incredible, and reconciling with our own elders and our own experience of culture as within ourselves, within our families, within our nations, that we get to experience through story that we don't often get elsewhere.
Yeah. Oh God, there's so many things on this question. So yeah, as Kakisimow Iskwew was saying, that you can track the changes in culture. So one of the ways this happened, stories adapt, and cultures to survive will um, adapt the culture to be invisible, to seem to be in support of the dominant society. So you'll have a god in a story who becomes a monster. You'll have one of the great
Devil.
beings who becomes the devil. Sorry, what did you say?
Yeah, the devil. Yeah, that's a
Yes.
common one.
Yeah, and you can track this by finding you find an older version, and oh, it's not the devil, it's this other part of nature, but now that's been turned into the devil. And you can see why the story did this to survive. But it's so important to, if you don't know the older version, if you don't know where that story comes from, or you don't know how to read it, to see what's still coded. I'm thinking of a story, The Devil and the Three Golden Hairs, where there's the devil, but there is coding in that story still that, if you know how to read it, tells you who the devil actually is and what he's been changed from. But you have to know how to read it. And we just don't anymore. And Stephen Jenkinson made a point. He said, these kelp beds, you see the kelp kind of grows up and then it bends when the water shifts. It would just go straight, but of course you have layers of tides, and so you can see what happens culturally when a story has changed. The change in the story tells you a lot about what's happened in the culture. And with stories, it's interesting, the connections between the words we use for story and the words we use for economics. For example, tally and tale, story and storage, the account of something, but also accounting. So there's something about, stories store a lot of information. There's a lot there. They help us keep track of things. And it's so important that, when we talk about in modern times holding people accountable, but it becomes synonymous with punishment, basically. If I'm going to hold you accountable, it means you are going to get something now. But if we look at the etymology of the word, it means able to account, like responsible, able to respond. So, and as opposed to react. And so, but what does it mean then to be able to account? Well, a number of things. One, it means you understand the story of how something came to be. And if you can't tell the story of how something came to be, you are dangerous and should not be let anywhere near the solution for that thing. So if somebody causes harm, one of the things that can happen is, well, do you understand, one, what's happened as a result of you doing this, and what might never ever happen? Somebody like Harvey Weinstein. I mean, do you understand the harm that you caused? Do you understand the careers that will never happen because of how you conducted yourself? But then there's also Harvey. Do you understand the story that made you? Because if you don't understand that story, it's very hard to do much because it's hard to come up with a prescription if you don't have the diagnosis right. There's the old story about, I got this from Caitlin Matthews in one of her, wrote a beautiful book, kind of a Celtic calendar of the year, a little bit of writing for every day. And she gives a very abridged version of the story where Merlin, the wizard, he sees a battle and it traumatizes him. He's so much carnage, and he runs into the woods and strips off his clothes, lives like an animal. And the people in Arthur's court try to get him, but he's seen what humans can do now. He's gotten the memo. The humans are horrific. And so he's just going to live like an animal. Thank you very much. I'm done with the court. I'm done with your civilization. And all the politics and political games, I'm out. Finally, Taliesin, who was his teacher, his mentor, finds him. And he trusts him enough, the one person he would trust to not run from. And Taliesin sits there, and I imagine approached him very slowly, and courted his presence. And finally, Merlin asks a question. It's the first time he's used English in a long time now. And of all the questions he could ask, he asked the question, why is there weather? And in the UK, there's a phrase that gets used for when somebody's snapped, which is they lost the plot, which is so telling. The trauma was so great, it threw him right out of the story of life. And so Taliesin, in response, doesn't say, oh, doesn't try to reason with him and it's not so bad, or it's, hey, it's very understandable and let's do some NVCM and empathize. He tells him the story of the creation of the world, all the way up to that point, which includes why there's weather and where weather comes from. And he restores him, stories him, and he brings him back into the fold of life, into this kinship, with all of life. And there's more to say, but I'll pause there.
Mhm. Yeah, just gonna let that settle for a moment. I love that. It gets me thinking about, I think there's a lot of like demonizing of the mind too in sort of our modern like wellness world, right? And yeah, we have the monkey mind and the mind, and I get where there's kind of this movement to decentralize or sort of deprioritize that a little bit, like take it down, because since the Enlightenment, we've kind of made it to be the be all end all of the world, at the cost of the body and the nervous system and the emotions and the spirit, intuition, instinct, all of that. But yeah, so it's gotten me kind of thinking about how, how much then, though, again, it's that thing that it's like that it's a burned bridge, and this comes up so much with clients, it's um yeah, that tracking things back. Can we actually understand why this is, the purpose of these things? And there's something profound in what you've both been sharing about that, calling people back to themselves, calling people back to being human, calling people back to being alive and being here, and doing that through like orienting, but not just orienting in the present, although that's important, or the place, although that's very important. But there's something about those layers of the stories, that it's like you're orienting them through multiple times and places and through, the podcast episode that just came out before this one, with Tammy Roloff. She was talking about how she had a vision one time when she was starting to connect with her ancestors, and she didn't realize she needed to connect with her ancestors really, because she was thinking her ancestors were just the ones she knew and could name. And she had a vision one time that was like those paper chains of humans, but instead of going side to side, it stretched back and forward, but it was like she could see all of them. And suddenly had this sense, oh, her ancestors weren't just the ones that she knew. They were, that it went back so much further than that. And that there were also, she'd always felt a little bit like a black sheep in her current ancestors, and always felt like, why am I the way I am? And am I wrong? Am I weird? And then there's kind of this like, as she started to connect with these longer ago ones, she started realizing, oh, there's actually a lot more who see the world the way I do and think about things the way I do than actually I'm led to believe by kind of our modern times, and the way things have kind of been done in my family for the last few generations and things like that. And just how deeply reparative it is, when you talk about reconciliation or when you talk about remembering, how deeply healing it is to not feel so lost and not feel so alone, and to like widen the gaze and suddenly see there's so much more. We've just been swimming in the little fishbowl, but actually there's a whole ocean, and um, yeah.
Well, and in the modern era of identity politics, where everything's identity and also self-identity, and I determine everything, I'll name myself. Thank you very much. The One of the things Stephen said that I loved is first generation trauma, second generation God. Meaning the thing that devastated your community in one generation, the next generation or the one after may deify it, may say, well, that's actually great. So in Scotland, you're colonized by the English, and the first generation fights against the English. But the kids or the grandkids want to be English, want nothing to do with the backward ways of their grandparents. who don't see progress and moving ahead. So, it's an old story that we take the modern ideas, which are a coping mechanism, and with the trauma, because you can't live in trauma forever. You can't just sit there in the trauma. So you have to do something with it. And I'd submit that identity is one of those modern iterations of something that was a trauma and has become a god. Because kinship, when you don't have kinship, you get identity, I would say.
Mm.
When you don't, it's the booby prize. It's a compensatory way of dealing with the fact that we don't have anyone giving us names anymore. So we have to name ourselves. Nobody's saying, so fundamentally, I see you. And in fact, your ancestors see you. And they whispered something in my ear, a little name that I want to give to you now. And a name that would be so affirming of you and the story of who you are. And we don't have that anymore uh, in a mass society way. It's still there in pockets, but boy, it's not there as a whole thing. And so we cling to the identity, but it's like clinging to a bag of chips when you could have an incredible feast of locally raised, food and food hunted for you and cooked by people you love. But if the bag of chips is all you have, I mean, of course we hold on. You hold on to the poverty if you don't have the cultural abundance, as you should. I mean, there's no chastising there. It's like, hey, a bag of chips might be better than starving. So beautiful. Hold on while you got it. And I suppose what you're doing in your work, Kate, and what the two of us are doing is we're just trying to do something about it. We're trying to make sure there's some food at the table so people know there's options, that there's just more, and something that might be more nourishing, which I remember talking with Martin Shaw, a storyteller from Devon, and I said, it strikes me that these modern compensations are like sugar, but stories are like fat. They're so nutrient dense. 1 little ounce of sugar and 1 ounce of fat. My God, the difference in nourishment. The sugar, I mean, hey, that keep you alive and get you through the day, but it's not going to be nourishing in the same way. And it has its own consequences long term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I love what you're saying about identity being it's the booby prize. That was great. And that, these stories, they're an option. They're a doorway to introduce you to that there is something more in the place that you come from. One of the things I think that's important when we're talking about story and culture and stories as a doorway to culture is to begin to unpack what do we even mean by that. If culture is not actually identity, what the heck is culture then?
Mm.
And that these stories are the doorway too. And one of the things that I have been able to sit with for a long time is what an elder shared with me when I was a youth. And I didn't get it then. And man, it's taken me to, being the parent of adult children to finally say, okay, I've wrestled with this one long enough. I think I'm starting to get it. But he would always say, we don't own our cultures. We don't own the language. We don't own the ceremonies. This was given to us, and that it's constantly on loan to us from our mother. And that our mother, not the mother of our bodies necessarily, but the mother of all of us. And in my language, we call her Nigawi Nanaski, or our mother, the earth. And that culture, the languages, the foods, the arts, the stories, they come from her, that they are all of these aspects of culture. They're different ways of us being given instructions on how to live with her. So if we look at, what are the words in your language? What are they describing? Up north, there's how many words for snow? Because that's a part of the relationship of people who live in those places that they have with their mother. And if you go to Australia, they've got words that they don't have up north because they're describing their direct experience of relationship with the land. And so language, we've homogenized a lot in speaking English, and it's pulled from a whole bunch of different places. But that these words, when we begin to explore culture, all words are not equivalent. So the inherent meaning behind, if I say a rose, there's that saying, a rose by any other name should smell as sweet. Yes, it smells the same, but the connotations are truly different because, that rose in that place, it might bloom only at that time, or it only grows beside this other plant, or there's these real lived experiences of what that word is actually referring to. And when somebody says the rain, the rain in Scotland is different than the rain in Vancouver, is different than the rain in Japan. And so the connotations of what those words mean, they're different. So the language, it's directly connected to the land that it's from. It's describing relationship with that land. And the foods, we were not eating bananas in North America once upon a time. Let me tell you, we have food experiences, and that part of culture is deeply rooted to our experience of relationship on the land. Our arts, nowadays we can bring in art materials from all kinds of places and we can learn everybody else's traditional arts. Once upon a time, our arts were one of the ways we expressed that story of our relationship with the land. And so these aspects of culture, they come from the land, all of it. It comes from that place that birthed that culture, that cradled it, that raised it up. And as she did that, she was teaching us how to live in that place in a good way, so that we weren't being abusive of our mother, so that we weren't just, we weren't biting the hand that was feeding us. And that's what culture holds, is the entire book of instructions of how to live on the land in a good way. So when we talk about why is story even important? Why are we bothering with any of this? Why isn't identity, it's good enough. It's good to have an identity. Why do we want to use story as a doorway to culture? Because we need an instruction book right now. Our way of doing things based on me and what I need, and this never-ending insatiability of human want and desire, it needs some instructions. It needs to be tethered. It needs a container to hold it that offers the boundaries that will produce abundance, that will deeply root us and connect us to something deeply meaningful. And that's what culture offers us. So, these stories that express so much of culture, that they're a beautiful container for culture, they're actually all those instructions of, at this time of year, here's what you're going to do. And you're going to bring this offering to say thank you to this spirit or deity or, person within that culture's mythology. And that offering that thanks is what gives you all of these other things. All of this is going to come out because you did this. And the deep poverty of our current reality, our current relationship with stories, is that we don't even know that that's what they're telling us, that we lack that cultural code or dictionary that says, here's what these things mean. Tad and I have encountered recently somebody saying, there is no way that that's all in that story. All those things you just talked to us about, there is no way. And, we could say, well, that's great. That's nice. But my first instinct was, this is the symptom of the depth of poverty that we are in, is we cannot even fathom, that our ancestors were that smart, that they were so connected, that they could create something that could hold so much. And so I love pausing and thinking, man, do we come from some hyper intelligent people and places and times where they could embed so much in a story. And that part of it, we don't go out and say, and here's everything it means. Blah, here you have it. This is this, and this is this, and they're relating in this way. That's not how we approach story. That's not how it unfolds. And it wouldn't have, hundreds or thousands of years ago as the story is being told. The goal of the story is not to lay it all at your feet immediately. You're not ready to hold it yet. And so it's just introducing you to the characters and, oh, this one does this thing. It doesn't tell you the deep cosmology, the deep meaning of the story right off the bat. You have to approach it in this almost spiral spinning way where you're going to be introduced to the people in the story, and then you're going to be introduced to, oh, well, there was this in the story and I remember that and I just experienced this and it happens at this time. So you begin to learn about the relationships in the story, and then there's some deep meaning, and we can continue spinning around in the story. So our goal isn't to tell people, come to us and we're just going to lay out the culture for you. And you're going to have this set of instructions. When you walk away, you can just go be, a true Scottish person. That's not what we're doing at all, but that we're introducing you to those spins around the story of, here's the people in the story. And did you know that this person has a relationship here? And here's how it's connected to the land. And so we're just at those levels. There's too much in a story for Tad and I, possibly as modern people, to fully understand, first of all. It would probably take our lifetimes dedicated to a single story to really be able to dig in that far. But we're starting those spins around the story and unpacking and sharing those things.
Yeah, I love what you're pointing to there, because I think we've been kind of dancing around it a couple times, but you're kind of going in there because, when we were talking about the burning of the bridge, when our ancestors left wherever they were and arrived wherever they arrived, and within a couple generations the bridge was burned. Some of that's that, yes, we don't have the people to tell the stories. We asked that question earlier, who's telling the stories that are calling people back? But also it's who can hear, who knows how to hear the story that's calling them back even when it's in front of them, and so again, it's relational, it's that two-way street. And so you're kind of landing in that there. And so I guess that's something I'd love to hear, you speak about, if you're up for it, is kind of a little bit of like, how do we kind of start, what are some skills maybe, or maybe this is a come to the workshop and find out kind of answer, but what are some skills people can start to kind of do? And also kind of the question of like, for me, some stories, I read them and I'm like, I think when I was younger, I would read stories that were probably the really deep, good ones, or there was like a middle age, I would say, probably not when I was like younger than I am now, but not when I was like really young. And there was something in me that would just be like, oh, I just don't get it. And I would kind of shut down. And so I think, and now it's like I read a story and I'm like, oh, I don't get it. Tell me more, because I'm like, oh, there's something here. So, but I think like you were talking about, sometimes it's just a different iteration of the story, but there's also a lot of stories now that are propaganda or that are serving certain agendas. I know, Tad, you've called them spells before and things, and maybe you want to talk about that, but yeah, so I guess how do we start to know which stories, or how do people even start to evaluate maybe the lens of the story so that they can even recognize which stories maybe to start to approach? And then is there a certain way we can start to approach the stories that we can become good listeners for the stories and good receivers of the stories, not just, when we encounter those who can tell us the stories, or when we somehow encounter the stories in their native habitat somewhere.
Man. Well, there's a lot. There's something we've been thinking about this, calling it the 4 invitations around stories. And we'll probably get more into that in one of the sessions coming up. I think the one on January 2nd is the we'll see what we can fit in. But I'll offer this up as because that may be more than we can dive into properly. But two thoughts. One, I think the most helpful way to approach a story is with this question, why would my ancestors have kept this story alive? Why, of all the things all the stories they could have kept, why this one? Because I don't think they would have kept it alive if it didn't have value for them and value for us. If they didn't want it to be something that was still with us in the world, if it didn't have some beauty and utility and nourishment for us, it wouldn't be. So that's to me just the overall orientation is starting with the assumption that our ancestors were smart people, that they had a lot of wisdom, that they had a connection to the land that is few and far between these days. And this story was a way of passing on teachings, that this story has teachings that are important for us and how we live. That's number one. And number two is to look at the story. I think one of the first places is look at every person in the story, everything in the story, each piece, and ask yourself, why this? Yeah, if it's a tree, why that tree? If it's a bird, why this bird? To understand that the story, gosh, who did I hear this from? A good man did a presentation. He had a great line where he just said, the story knows what it's doing. Yeah, the details matter in a story. And it's very easy. And this is one of the tragedies in story. I was talking with George McPherson about this, where there's a story about called Torm Krupach. And in this story about this fellow Norman who you get through the story, he's got rheumatoid arthritis. And he is taken to the other world and he's beaten with some witch hazel and stinging nettles. There's a reason it happens, but he's beaten with this, and this, when he comes back, he no longer has the rheumatoid arthritis. And of course, the story has a teaching there, excuse me, of the particular plants that do this. But in some versions, people just say, and then they grabbed a bunch of, sticks and things from the bushes and beat him with them. But they leave out the details and the names. But the whole point is the names. So those are two things I would say. One, start with the assumption that this story does have merit and value. And number two, attend to the details.
Mm-hmm. And I would add, if you're called to a story, one of the ones that I'm just feeling a deep need to dig into and with specific people is Cinderella. And if you're called to that story, what are the other versions that exist that you're still able to find? That, that type of research, that goes into academia. And so they did some of the legwork of finding that out for you. So research that too. The stories are intelligent. The details matter, and the details might have shifted a little bit every now and then. And that's also important to know, that if something does shift over 1,000 years, over 200 years, ask yourself, why did that shift? So when we're working with Briar Rose or Sleeping Beauty, sometimes what Sleeping Beauty pricks her finger on is a spinning wheel. And if you go back further, it's a spindle. Now, why did that shift? Does that matter? Does that detail matter? And it turns out it matters so much, so much. But that there came a point in history where the spindle wasn't as culturally relevant anymore. And so what happened at that point? So we can even say, when did that shift? Because the spinning wheel didn't exist at a certain point. And so we know when the shifts happen when we look at the changes in those details. So there's just those couple of things, starting with the right approach, looking at those details and investigating well, okay, well, what is witch hazel then for Norm? I can't say it like like Tad can, but Norman Cooper. Why?
Norman and his cow.
Yeah, Norman and Ailey. But why that plant? Learn about the plant. Learn about everything that you read that's actually named in that story. Learn as much as you can about those things. And you are at that that doorstep of culture when you begin to learn about all of those things named in the story. You're right at the doorway there.
And also to pay attention to what's changed and then what hasn't changed. What are the details in the multiple versions that stay the same? Because if it didn't change, there's probably a reason it didn't change. That's probably one of those details that the old people understood either explicitly or just implicitly. We don't mess with this part of the story. There's some parts of the story that may, it depends on there's some just funny stories. And you can, there's all these jokes, I remember hearing you grew up like Polish jokes. Well, the same jokes in Ireland, same jokes in Scotland. You can change the names and and it doesn't matter. But with some of the bigger stories, I mean, the bigger the story gets, the less details you mess with. And then there's a certain level of stories you mess with, no details. You tell it exactly the way it was told because all those details are important. But some of the stories that have been passed down to us might have been those higher stories. And the details did change, but out of, a need for them to survive. And, one of the reasons I think also to just keep in mind, why did these stories get continually told over and over? In Gaelic, there's a phrase, gloom gugloon, which is like knee to knee, meaning child sitting on my knee. And then I grew up, now there's a child sitting on my knee. Is that the stories teach us our role as human beings, but also the roles of everything. What function is everything playing? So we understand the role of humans, which is so desperately missing these days. We don't even know why humans are in the world. So that's a precarious situation to be in, where you don't even know why you're here. And then, as if it's empowering, I mean, to me, this is the poverty masquerading as wealth well, this is the best part of modern society. You get to figure this out. But I don't have a clue. No, I know you don't have a clue, but you get to look for the clues now. Isn't this wonderful? And maybe at a big spiritual level, this is really proper and appropriate for our time. But that's a rough ride to have to be fashioning a worldview rather than inheriting one. But it tells us our roles as men and women. It tells us our roles. Also, it tells us why stories matter. It tells us what's the role of intellect, as you were saying in the beginning. That, the mind has a function. It has a role, and it's very easy. It's like the reverse of we're going to turn the gods into demons. Well, thank goodness we're out of the superstition, and we're out of religion. So we're so advanced. We're now into this scientific world, and now we're even past that. We're into the postmodern world. I mean, we went right from superstition to religious fundamentalism to the Enlightenment, and now we are we've progressed so far. We're post all of that, and now we throw the intellect out.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. It's the exact same pattern being repeated. Of who's welcome and who's not. Even desire and hunger and thirst, there's a role for that. And you could learn from stories what the role of that is. It makes me think there was Antonio Machado had this beautiful little 4-line poem. And it says, "It is good to know that cups are for drinking from. The bad thing is not to know what thirst is for." And there's two meanings of this. I think one is, what are you thirsty for? It's good to know that. That you can get thirsty and think it's for the wrong thing. But the second is, what is the function of thirst? And so in modern times, we are deeply thirsty for in Indo-European mythology, there's this word soma, but this water of life. We're deeply thirsty for these waters of life. But but we don't know what the thirst is for. What is the function of thirst? If you're going to be walking around thirsty and you don't see that thirst may have some other function beyond you getting quenched every time you want it, just the way you want it, then you're probably going to behave badly.
Yeah, this is fabulous. Thank you for bringing up the thirst and behaving badly when you're thirsty. This brings us to one of the things that we encounter all the time, which is protocol. That, understanding that because I am hungry for something, because I deeply feel the need of something, doesn't mean that I get to take it with no thought of how I go about approaching that thing. I'm not worried about anybody else in the process. I need that. And so there it is, and I'm going to take it now. And that manner of approach, it is a symptom of not having experienced the culture. That within every culture, there is a manner of approach of how we go about interacting with cultural things. And for my elder, Nokum Joanne, she would say, protocol it opens up culture for you so that not only can you get those answers, but you can actually use them. You can believe them. You can put them to action in your own life when we understand how important they are. One of the things that I was taught is that there are protocols for everything, and that protocol not only is at the doorway, but it helps us keep the balance of the universe that we are in. That if you think of, this scale, that if I need something deeply and I'm asking for it from this side, and they're going to say, okay, fine, I see you and you're hungry and I'm going to give you this. And so we're tipping the scale this way, and they're like, oh, I see that you're getting stronger, and, I brought this for you, and so you can have this too. And then we're getting lower on one side of the scale as we receive. That protocol is one of our opportunities to balance the scales again, to give back, to ask in a beautiful way, to bring that offering for those teachings, for those stories. And part of the cultural poverty of today for many peoples is that they don't know how to go about asking for those things. And so they approach with deep hunger and a deep ignorance of the protocols. And so they'll show up and say, I just want it point form, give it to me right now. I'm ready. I can hear it all. And that tells that person, you're not ready for it yet. You're ready to learn about protocol though. And so we approach this when we're talking about stories, is that you're hungry and that's why you're here. And we get it. We sit in hunger all the time too. But that one of the things that we learn when we're dealing with the cultural, as stories are inherently, is that we're learning how to approach in a beautiful, respectful way that honors the deep importance of these things that we're looking at. And, we've experienced these stories Disneyfied, which sometimes they did a good job of it, and sometimes they truly didn't do a good job of it. But it's been on demand. We can go turn on Sleeping Beauty whenever we want, and it's become transactional. If I paid some money, I got the thing, and now I'm entitled to that thing. Anytime I can push a button and I can hear it over and over and over again. And that's not how culture works, but that's how we have become accustomed to interacting with the world around us. Mm-hmm. And so I might have a deep hunger for all of it. I want to know every aspect of my culture deeply. For thousands of years back, I want to know all of it. But that doesn't mean I get to have it all right now. And that culture, when we're young, when we're immersed, if we are blessed to be brought up in the culture of those people that we descend from, and we're brought up, and every day we're experiencing it just a little bit. And we're experiencing it passively at first as a baby, and we're taking it all in, but it's little bits at a time. Nobody's sitting in front of the baby saying, and here it all is, and this is this and this is that. And that's not how it's experienced. It's a little bit, and it's lived. And as you get older, you live it a little bit more and you're then participating in it. And then you get a little bit more, you get the responsibility of tending to it. And I have daughters who are at an age where they're now responsible for living culture in different ways. They have to go get the firewood and they have to break it into certain size pieces and they have to handle it a certain way and then store it a certain way. That's living culture. And so it's going in this graduated, leveled way. And your ancestors were wise enough to put that story into this encapsulated way for you. And when you approach that in a good way, it unfurls. And then when you approach that in a good way, it unfurls. So we can't approach story. We can't show up and say, I paid for this. Now give it all to me right now. Point form in 1 hour, please. I'd like a recording so I can just keep pressing play on this and I'm going to have the entire thing. That's not how this works. That if we want to get culture, we have to approach it in a cultural way. And as so many of us haven't had that opportunity to approach something in a deeply cultural way, a big part of what people who carry stories do is they help people understand. And here's the protocol inherent in this process. It might not be the protocol of your ancestors 2,000 years ago. It's honoring the protocols as we begin to learn and experience this as modern people, but that the protocol is inherent and it's necessary in any cultural work.
It's connected to that and connected to the hunger. So people have this hunger in modern times. I mean, unbelievable hunger that if we were to really face it, could be just so overwhelming. And does overwhelm us properly and has and continues in most of our lives. I think we've all been victims to various hungers that have had us do things that we look back and think, oh, I could have behaved more beautifully than that. But then it's easy to say, well, then the hunger is the problem. We just got to get all Buddhist and get on the other side of desire and then everything's going to be okay. But what if hunger had a function? What if the thirst itself had a function? And I would submit that one of the functions of the hunger and thirst was that it's something to be hijacked. That the elders, in the culture might say, oh, they're coming of age and they're starting to, the hormones are rising. They're starting to notice the others that they're attracted to there. And they are in the process of losing their minds. With desire is coming alive. So let's use that. And so, you would have these initiations, these rites of passage, and all of that mad energy that's coming in now gets put to the wagon, and protocol is the harness maybe of this. It's like, oh, you want something really bad. Okay, well, we want you to have that's great. We want you to have the thing what you want. We're not, fuddy-duddies. We get it, but we're going to help you get there, and we're going to do it in such a way that, one, more culture is made. That your desire, your mad thirst for something can become an occasion for the culture to reconstitute itself and feed itself and come alive again. But number two, that it turns you into somebody who's actually worthy and capable of holding the thing you desire. Because, I would give this caution too. Okay, you want to understand these old stories. Are you sure? Are you really sure that you want, well, it's my right to understand it. Okay. But could it be that there are responsibilities attendant to receiving those teachings? And do you really want to pick those up? Do you really want to take on the burden of, okay, now you know something, so you're responsible to do something with it in your life. You're responsible to pass them on and to pass them on in a way that makes more culture and makes more beauty in the world. Is that something that you really want? And it's worth at least pausing. I'm hungry for something, but does that mean I'm ready for it? And of course, in the modern world, it could just be like, well, I'm just going to hey, did you get the recording of Tad and Kâkîsimow Iskwêw's thing? Great. Can I just have that? And I'm not going to pay for it, or I'm just going to get all these teachings. And, we all have access to it. Great. But is it for you, all the teachings? Are you the final destination? And so that what? So we can walk around feeling wise and feel like we know all the codes to everything. Because if you walk around with all the codes to everything, but you're not using them for the benefit of the world and future generations, then you don't understand anything about the codes.
Yeah. I've been talking a lot recently about, just making this shift from resource to relationship, and that's like, I think, a fundamental cultural shift that for more animist and one could possibly say more indigenous ways of connecting with things, is so what you're kind of pointing to there, Tad, like the stories aren't just one more resource we can extract from, the codes aren't one more resource we can take and put on the shelf, in the pantry for next time we're hungry, it's a relationship that needs tending. And
Well,
yeah, you were talking about were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that the protocol is a food
Mm, mm,
also. But I want the codes. The codes are the food. No, the protocol is part of what's going
mm.
to nourish you.
Yeah, well, and I love, I think there's this, well, first off, quickly, Tad, too, when you were talking about roles earlier, I realized I think that's what identity, I don't know, like the difference between role and identity, that's where I think I'm finding myself curious. Something was kind of clicking for me as you were speaking earlier about roles. I was like, oh, when we don't have roles, because roles are more relational and more contextual, and more communal,
Yeah,
then
because
that's what I think.
identity is all tangled up with the copula, the verb to be. That's
Hmm.
identity. I am this.
Hmm.
But there's lots of languages that don't have the verb to be. So where does your identity go if you can't say I am or you are? You gotta lean on all these other verbs that describe what is being done, that describe function much more than form. Because there's also a lot of languages that lean much more heavily on verbs
Verbs and
than
nouns.
nouns.
Yeah. Yeah, love that.
And that gives you your instructions, doesn't it? When you take that I am out of it, when you remove the identity focus and you focus on the role, if I say I am a firekeeper, there is nothing immediately I have to do about that. But if I say I am keeping fire,
Mm.
I
Mm.
keep fire, and I'm, out surfing at that moment, it doesn't make sense. So what it does is it offers me the instructions of I'm going to stoke the logs now. I'm going to go get the firewood. It tells me the instructions of what I need to do because that role has very clear paths forward. If I'm building, I'm a builder, then I am building.
Mm.
I build.
Mm.
It actually gives you the instructions of one foot in front of the other, what it is you are to do now.
Mm. Yeah, which lets it be situational and fluid and also encourages presence and focus on the task when you are in the role of that in the moment. Yeah, that's beautiful.
I also wanted to tie this back to the word we started with, and that was that we're exploring the indigenous memory of Mother Europe.
Yeah, I was going to
And
say, I was like, we've explored culture, we've explored whiteness, but we haven't actually gone to indigenous yet. So yes, I'm glad you're taking us
there's
there.
something needing attention here still.
Yeah.
And this comes up often, when we're sharing that this is coming up and we have that title in it, and it's triggered people. And Tad has asked, should we change this? Should we change this title? And he doesn't want to trigger people. And usually my answer is no, I don't think we should change it. This conversation is important enough. And if that's how we arrive at the conversation that needs to happen, then this is good. And we don't want to trigger people in a traumatizing way, but that the conversation is actually necessary, that these stories that they hold culture that is not from 50 years ago. And it's not even often from 100 years ago, that we're going back through the layers of time to that connection to place that was held in that by those people within that culture. And for me, as an Indigenous woman in North America, quote unquote, there's big air quotes happening when I say North America, I have to ask myself and unpack, what does it mean to be an Indigenous person today? You know, there's many of us who have experienced incredibly traumatizing colonization within our families, who don't speak the language, who do not practice the ceremonies, we don't know the medicines or the arts or the traditions. This is a very real experience for people who would walk around with the label of Indigenous in North America. And I unpack this regularly in the work that I do with other Indigenous women. Well, what does it mean then to be an Indigenous woman? What does it mean to participate in the culture of that land that we are from? And for me, that's what it is I'm not, I have the right to my culture as an Indigenous person. And I don't say that with entitlement. It's a birthright. It's something we're born needing that access to. And the way that I access that is by offering protocol. And what it allows me to be is Indigenous. It allows me to participate within the Indigenous culture of my homeland, of my nation. And for me, it's the height of hubris to say that's what we are, and it does not exist anywhere else on the planet. In fact, it goes against our culture. For Métis people, for people of Nehio ancestry, so that's what in modern times people would call Cree. The actual term that we have for ourselves is Nehio. We're taught we're not better than anybody else. We're not more correct, that we were given a piece of truth, and that's ours to carry and to nurture. And it does not make us above anybody else, and that there is truth elsewhere also. The Sami in Northern Europe, they have truth too, and they have a living culture that connects them to the land they are from. And if you go elsewhere, if you go to Australia, they have truth too, and they have a culture that teaches them how to live on that land. And that's actually true of everywhere you go around the planet, that there is an original culture from that place that taught people how to live in that place in a good way. And so we can't say that anybody from any place, that there was never a culture there, that there was no value to it, that it didn't offer those same instructions to those people for that place, that it's inherently true, that that's what culture does. And that's the relationship that we have with it. So anywhere where people have been, there is a culture that is Indigenous to that place, and it gave them those instructions that they needed. And that does not mean that where we are at right now with the people who were originally from that place, who dispersed, colonization didn't just mean that cultures were taken over and, moved off of their land and resources extracted. Colonization means taking people from one place and putting them in the other. Colonization requires settlement. And so all of these people needed to be taken from where they were Indigenous and plopped somewhere else. And that process, that forgetting of where they came from, it created that new identity that they have and that new way of relating to life and to the land. And perhaps in some instances, I'd say in North America, we've experienced that what happened was severe abuse because of that forgetting, severe abuse of the land, of the water, of the air, of the people, of each other. And so that hunger and drive and abuse and lack of relating well, that's not culture at all. That's not even what that is. We don't come from a North American culture. There is no such thing as white culture. That forgetting did not create a new culture. But that if those people wanted to dig and they wanted to go, get the shovel and find the stories and begin to dig, what they will arrive at is a memory that is held by that story of when those people lived in a place they were indigenous to, because those plants that they're mentioning and those birds and those animals and those relationships and the times of year, it's all pointing back to the relationship with the land that those people had in the place that they're from. And that's indigeneity. It's the state of being where you are from the place that you are original to. And I mean, there's problems with that language of being native to a place, because we've all been moving around for, a very long time. But that where the culture arises and where the culture grows, where those stories are from, that's that indigeneity. And so we use the term in that way, that there is a rooting for that story and that culture to a place, and that there's a memory of that indigeneity, of that experience within that story. So that's why we use that. And it brings up this conversation of what does it even mean to be Indigenous? Not Indigenous, capital I, as an adjective where we're describing a noun. That's not what we're talking about. It's about the verb of being Indigenous, of living in that way with those instructions from that culture on the land. That's a layer of indigeneity also.
And I would say it's in many ways indistinguishable from being human. When we say being indigenous and being human, given that most of our ancestors' names for themselves meant the people, meant humans. But I think, one, we've forgotten why humans are here in modern society. And we've also, we no longer know the function of ourselves. And so, I just see a kinship between when we say indigenous, that humans might actually have a beautiful function in the world. And that function is primarily a kind of obedience. And obedience, there's a word that brings up, it's not meaning, oh, yes, 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 whatever, but listening. Of course, it comes from that root of to listen. And there's a beautiful quote by John Cage, and he says, "I have nothing to say, and I am saying it. And that is poetry, and I need it." So I'll say that again. I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it. And that is poetry, and I need it. So I'll say that again, but I'm going to change one word. I have nothing to say, and I am saying it. And that is story, and I need it. So, what could this mean? Well, so I have nothing to say, meaning, well, me as an individual human, I don't have a lot to contribute, but the world has a lot to say. Nature has a lot to say. The what's the word? Nigawanaski, something like this. Our Mother Earth, she has a lot to say. So me personally, not much, but our Mother Earth has a lot to say, and my ancestors had a lot to say. So I'm saying it, and that's story. Story is me passing on these entrustments, and I need it. And there's the whole thing. We need story. It's not because humans just sat around and said, what's the wisest thing we can think of to say? And came up with it on their own. But they saw that the people before them had already noticed some things. And those people, they noticed that from the world. They received the teachings from the plants and the animals, thank goodness, kept them alive. And now they're passing those things on. So, I think for Kakisimow Iskwew and myself both, we have nothing to say. But the work on Briar Rose, that's us saying it. And that's story. And I think we need it.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I'm feeling like that's a beautiful place to start to wrap. I mean, there's a lot of other things, and maybe, if you both are open to it and it feels helpful, maybe actually this becomes a two-parter at some point, because I think there's also interesting conversation to be had. Some other threads I was kind of tracking are sort of also in these moments when you're rerouting into the story and the culture that might have been more indigenous to where your ancestors are from, and yet how many generations have you been on this other land, and at what point then do you have a certain kinship and level of responsibility to that land, even though you're not quote unquote indigenous to that place, and being in between those two places. I mean, I think that could be a whole conversation that we don't need to go into tonight in this particular moment. And then one other little thing just to say is yeah, I think too, I'm loving that you're calling it protocol, because I think what I some of what you're pointing to with that protocol is I think something that is also sometimes referred to as gatekeeping, in the sense of like initiatory gatekeeping, not gatekeeping as a power imbalance and an oppressive dynamic. And again, gatekeeping is another one of those things that I think has gotten very like out, taboo. No, everyone should have access to everything. And again, when there's been oppression, yes, of course, but you know, um, yeah, you're initiated into things. And anyway, and that got me thinking about extrinsic and intrinsic motivations and, being ready for things. Anyway, yeah, lots I've been thinking about. So might be interesting to have another conversation sometime. But I would love to kind of, as we're wrapping here, offer you both a chance to kind of speak more specifically. I know, this episode is not going to come out in time for your 3-hour online workshop that's happening tomorrow from when we're recording this, but it will come out before, I believe you're starting a 6-week program for Briar Rose, and I know you'll have some other in-person and possibly online things. So is there anything more you want to say about the actual offering of, your different offerings for exploring Briar Rose or other things you might have coming up?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's been so lovely to sit with you. And goodness, yes, tugging at those other threads is a beautiful thing for sure. There's this spiraling, unfurling when we get together and explore these topics. And that's really what, when we're coming together and talking around about Briar Rose, we're experiencing is we're sitting in a way connected to these cultural stories. And it's this unwinding of the story. And we've experienced this a few times, and this, Tad and I have done this in several places now, and a couple of times, and we're taking it online tomorrow, which is going to be wonderful and fabulous to be able to work with people from even further away. This is an invitation, and it's going to be the right story for people and the wrong story for other people, and that's okay. That, Briar Rose, when you sit and you come and you sit through it and you're working with it, and you're just like, it's just not calling me. Remember that there are so many stories that we can work with, and so many people doing this important work. And, one of the things that is important to me is that I always support those knowledge keepers and elders who are out there sharing those things from within my culture. And that if nothing else, I'm showing up with protocol and asking them a question. Because if I don't, then it's not being shared, and it's not a sense of self-importance. There are so many elders and knowledge keepers and medicine people in my community who died never passing those teachings on because nobody showed up with protocol and nobody asked. And these stories haven't died, and they're still here, and they're starving, just like you're starving for them, they're starving for you. And what we're doing is we're just, every time we utter these stories, and every time we speak them, every time we ponder them, but even more, every time we put their instructions into practice in our lives, we're feeding them. So we're inviting you to come and be fed, but to feed the story, to feed the cultural process that holds these stories. That's the invitation. And it's all new. Doing this in this way, our old, ancient, traditional cultures, this isn't how they'd go about doing that. And so we're putting that right out. This is not what that is. So we're not even pretending it is. but that we're feeding it, maybe not the food that it was accustomed to once upon a time, but we're feeding it by sitting together and wondering about the story and uttering it out loud in a beautiful way. So that's the invitation that we have for others, is to come and sit and be fed, but also feed the story back.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'll let those words be our last ones, unless Tad, you have anything else. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you, Tad. Thank you, Kakisimow Iskwêw. Yeah, this has been an incredible, yeah, conversation. Yep. I'll have the link in the show notes. Yeah, so it's meetingmyancestors.com and I believe slash Briar Rose. Yeah, Briar-Rose. So yes, but I'll have that in the show notes in case people are feeling the call. And I love that you spoke to that, just that, yeah, um, it is about like feeling the call, not just because it's there, you know. Um, yeah. So yeah. Mm. So yeah, so for everyone listening, um, often in a lot of these conversations that feel like they're much more in that sort of spiral, circular, the word I'm thinking of is escaping me right now, but kind of more of oh gosh. Yeah, no, okay. Like more of where the lessons aren't explicit, they're a little bit more implicit learning. And so, yeah, so I'm just inviting everyone listening to just kind of let this conversation settle in whatever way it does, as we've been speaking to in this conversation, trusting that the layers of meaning of it will arrive to you based on what you're ready to hold and what you're hungry for. And um, yeah, and um, that if you're feeling called, if the combination of hunger and ready to holdness is feeling called, then yes, I encourage you to connect with Tad and Kâkîsimow Iskwêw and yeah, and Briar Rose and um, yeah. Otherwise, we'll see you next time around the fire. And thanks for listening. And thank you both for all that you've shared and all the voices that you've spoken on behalf of.